Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, Navigating the New Normal, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society and the economy, real estate and technology, medicine and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plout. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, AFRMC, a 501c3 National American Charitable Organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence. It serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. And now, during this time of war, the hospital is a front line of Israel's defenses, treats the many wounded Israeli soldiers and civilian casualties. We remain in awe of the doctors and nurses at Israel's Rabin Medical Center in the ER, ICU, and orthopedic departments as they respond to the October 7th atrocities. Please support our mission. Join our community of friends. Visit American Friends of Rabin Medical Center via our website and social media outlets on Twitter and Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube, and on our Facebook page and discussion group. Today's Global Connections topic is why conspiracies? Thank you to our very special guest, Nancy L. Rosenblum, Professor Emeriti of Ethics and Politics and Government at Harvard University. Jesselyn Cook, author and Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. And David G. Rand, professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Thank you, Josh. We read and we hear stories about conspiracies that Americans believe in, strange conspiracies that are hatched, we're told, in the dark places where the mandarins of the deep state reside and plot and scheme. Elections that were allegedly rigged and then stolen, although there's no evidence to support such a claim. Rings of depraved Democrats who are abducting and abusing children. Again, there's no evidence for such things. Claims that 9/11 was an inside job by the U.S. government, or that forest fires are started by lasers from space that are operated by the Rothschilds, and that immigrants in Ohio are stealing pet cats and dogs from the locals to eat them. Conspiracy theories abound. They flourish in cyberspace, where audiences of millions can potentially be reached by contributors who face no editor demanding some information about the sources for these stories, no publisher or network president who's defending his outlet from information that's fraudulent or nonsensical or abusive and might get the institution in trouble. And from there, from cyberspace, these conspiracy theories circulate as self-justifying. A lot of people are saying this, which is to say, there must be something to this, or there could be. A lot of people are saying is, in fact, the title of a book co-authored by our first panelist in this discussion of conspiracy theories and their prevalence. We will also hear from a journalist who has met and written about families that have been divided when one member embraces the bizarre beliefs of the conspiracy known as QAnon, and from an MIT scholar who helped conduct an experiment to dissuade believers in fake conspiracies by using artificial intelligence. We begin with Nancy Rosenblum, who is a political scientist, political philosopher, and is professor emerita at Harvard University, where she has studied the effects and the intentions behind conspiracism. That's what she calls contemporary conspiratorial thinking, conspiracy theories that are long on the conspiracy and short on the theory. She and Russell Muirhead are authors of the book that I just mentioned. A lot of people are saying. And Professor Nancy Rosenblum, welcome and thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
First, a reality check. Is this definitely a boom time for conspiracy theories? If we're hearing about fluoridation now, I go back to we were told that was by some people that was a communist plot. The story about the cats and the dogs in Ohio, to me, is a reworking of the blood libel. But plain and simple, that's pretty old. So how big are conspiracy theories or conspiracism nowadays?
Well, they have always existed. They're very big today. And one reason is simply technological, that it's very easy for these notions to be spread
Mm-hmm.
and for people to find them gratifying in a number of ways. What makes this different from most conspiracism in the past is that it's taken hold at the center of American government. Not
Mm-hmm.
only American government, of course, but that it's coloring public life and coloring political life in a very destructive, very destructive way. And you mentioned that theory more or less. I think the other interesting thing about conspiracism today
Yeah.
is that it's conspiracy without the theory. That is, I think most conspiracy theories are just that. If you think of the Declaration of Independence, it says we hold these truths to be self-evident. But it wasn't self-evident that the colony should divide from the federal government, from Britain. And there were about 16 reasons given for why the colonies had to separate from them. And that's true today of most conspiracies out there. They are conspiracy theories about 9/11 or about the Kennedy assassination. And
Mm-hmm.
what we see today, which is new, at least new in public life, is the sheer assertion of some sort of conspiracy going on. There's no evidence, there's no reasoning, there's just assertion. Marjorie Taylor Greene saying last week that the federal government was controlling hurricanes. Yes, they can control the weather. It's ridiculous for anyone to lie and say it can't be done. And so the interesting question is, what is the purpose that this
Mm-hmm.
kind of conspiracism without the theory is serving, and how does it work?
You write about delegitimation. I don't want to leave a syllable out of that. Delegitimation, that this is what the end result of so many conspiracy theories seems to be, to undermine all sources of authority and of authority over knowledge, not just political power, but the power to decide what's best for us to do about a pandemic, for example.
Exactly right. I think that what we see is a foundational conspiracy claim made by Trump. It's the notion of the deep state. And the beauty of this notion that there's an enemy deep state within is that there's nowhere it can't go. And so you can attack any institution or any kinds of political action as the work of this deep state. And you're right that the purpose of it, or what the one purpose of it, not the only, but the purpose of it is to delegitimate really the actions of the machinery of government. It says that there's no such thing as specialized knowledge. It's just elitism that's being abused against enemies, or the procedures of the machinery of government. The law of rules is also that cooked up. And so the result of this is, as you say, delegitimation. And the reason I find this idea so important is that it's not quite the same as distrust. We have distrust of lots of institutions for lots of reasons, including very good reasons in this country. What's going on here with conspiracism is delegitimation. That is the notion that these agents, these procedures, these laws have no value and no authority. And when you say that they're not legitimate, that they have no value or authority, what you're doing is removing the warrant from compliance. And that's why so much of the conspiracism in American politics and public life today is motivating intimidation and threats and violence, because the underlying laws and machinery have been delegitimated.
Your book made me think of episodes in totalitarian states when Joseph Stalin decided which geneticist he liked, and that became geneticism in the genetics in the Soviet Union, and set back Soviet science by some years. I recently read about the far right wing German Nobel laureates in physics who opposed nuclear physics as Jewish physics. In both of those cases, there's some understandable ulterior motive to all of this, not just knocking down other sources of authority, but erecting alternative institutions of authority. Where's the positive? Where's the positive part of this wave of conspiracism? Where's
Well,
the part
I wouldn't call it
no, well,
positive,
not
but
positive
it
meaning
is,
good, but I mean doing something.
but it is purposive.
Yeah.
And there's no question that this deconstruction of laws, but also of the entire administrative state, has as its purpose doing away with what we think of as office or the authority that people have, and saying that there is no authoritative source except personal will. That's what's different under Trump. That is, conspiracism is used to degrade and vandalize the institutions of government and to substitute for the constraints of office a liberated personal will. So this isn't quite like the systematic notion of fascists or others. It really is quite unleashed personal will, and we're seeing it right now uh, with Trump's appointments to or nominees to important posts in the government.
I just wanted to ask you before we hear from Jesselyn Cook, who really has investigated this particular question. If I'm told that fires in the West are caused by space lasers that the Rothschilds operate, what do you think is the attraction to me? That is, I'm not one of those who's going to be in power because this idea gains some currency. But what do you think it is that makes such an idea appealing to at least some Americans?
I wouldn't say that this idea in general. What we're interested in is political conspiracism, and what makes that appealing to people is something quite specific, I think,
Mm-hmm.
which is if you join in, say, Trump's cult of reality, his malignant notion of reality, then first of all, you're joining in a we. It's a collective endeavor. Second, and a politically potent collective endeavor. Second of all, you're enjoying sort of performative aggression by making these claims against deep state and enemies of the nation. And I think those are the two main ones.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the third is that you become part of a cognoscenti. You have secret knowledge. You understand what's really going on that other people can't. And those three things, especially the cult aspect of it, the first, but those three things can have very powerful holds on people.
Well, Nancy Blumenthal, thank you very much. Stay with us because you're going to come back, I hope, for the discussion period. But we're going to turn now to our next panelist, Jesselyn Cook, who is author of The Quiet Damage. The book's subtitle is QAnon and the Destruction of the American Family. Jesselyn Cook is a Canadian-American journalist. She was an investigative reporter for NBC News and a senior reporter for HuffPost. This year, she's a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. And for several years, she's been interested in the QAnon conspiracy and what happens to families when one member starts believing its claims. 5 such families are the subjects of her book. Jesselyn Cook, welcome, and thanks for joining us today.
Really happy to be here. Thanks.
The stories you tell are frankly heartbreaking, and I wonder if you can relate one theme or 2 themes that you found that recurred often in these families' experiences, families which are they span certain differences of socioeconomic status, race, but what they have in common is somebody in the family starts believing that the deep state is about to destroy America.
So for the research for this book, I talked to hundreds of people all over the country who have come to believe these wild ideas that are not based in reality. And I wanted to dispel this notion that there's one type of conspiracy theorist. I think there's a stereotype that maybe it's a baby boomer, someone who's white, someone who's a Trump supporter or conservative. And that's really not the case. And so what the common denominator I found across the families featured in the book was a sense of powerlessness. And this can be something, as Nancy was saying, that people have a real reason to feel a sense of distrust and powerlessness. One of the characters in the book is a mother of color who grew up in extreme poverty, facing extreme racism. She had a lot of reasons to feel powerless and to feel that she did not believe what she was being told by the government or by sources of institutional power. But powerlessness is also something we can be conditioned to feel. And one of the other characters in the book is a kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. She's very wealthy. She's very educated. She's a lawyer. She's had a pretty privileged life. But for her, it really started out on Fox News. She just started getting this drip of victim mentality rhetoric and this narrative over and over again that the powers that be were out to get her and they were going to raise her taxes. They were going to take away her guns. They were going to do all these things to harm her and her family in some way. And so she started feeling aggrieved and powerless. And you need to have that victim mentality to be an intense conspiracy theorist, because the whole idea is that these powerful forces are out to get you.
But as you would warn us against generalization as to who these people are, the African American woman you describe, who grew up poor and remained poor as an adult and as a parent, had a sister who grew up in the same circumstances and found political activism to be her response to her problems, not the subterfuge of the deep state. Something. Same environment, different outcomes. And didn't the woman whom you mentioned, who became a lawyer, this was after her husband, who she thought was prosperous, as I recall, turned out to be an addictive gambler, unbeknownst to her, and his gambling debts, drove him to suicide. So I wondered in that case, is there some trauma associated with rethinking what the whole world is about and what life is about?
Absolutely. With many of the stories I reported on, including those that didn't make it into the book, there was some preceding factor. Something shifted in their life where one of their needs was not being met. They in the case of this mother whose husband was gambling and died by suicide, she had this deep anger at the world that she kind of held on to for a long time. And eventually her kids moved away and she was just by herself, stewing in her powerlessness. And yeah, it in many cases, it was some kind of trauma, some kind of big life change. For some people, COVID, that really preceded their path into conspiracy theory obsession. And I should note, the families in this book, this is conspiracy theories for them are not something they dip their toe in. It's not something they dabble in or believe one or two. It has really, their ideology has become their identity. It has reached an extreme state and they are obsessed. And so I really did want to explore the different paths into that and what it is that conspiracy theories do for them on a deeper level.
I'm glad you mentioned COVID because of the time in which you were doing your research, COVID figures quite often, and COVID was experienced differently by different people, and to some of these people whom you're writing about, COVID was the government's opportunity to force everyone to take a vaccine, which according to some theory, would have what was inside the vaccine, some kind of chip that would make you subject to government surveillance. COVID was what forced you to wear a mask against your will, so it would rob you of freedom. These were all sort of dissenting views of what the COVID pandemic was like, and it recurred quite a bit. Do you think it accelerated? Do you think it accelerated some conspiratorial beliefs?
Absolutely, I do. I think COVID did two things. It made ordinary people more susceptible to believing in conspiracy theories, and it made conspiracy theory peddlers more powerful and more effective because we had this big information void. It was a very scary time early in COVID. We didn't know what the virus could do. We didn't know how to stop it. We didn't know where it came from. And these questions take time to answer. And there were good scientists doing good research, but people were afraid. They were driven by emotion and fear, and they wanted answers right away. And these information voids present opportunities for movements like QAnon to swoop in and fill that void with their own twisted version of events, their own narratives. And so there suddenly became this grand conspiracy that all these different players, the media, the government, the deep state, Bill Gates, everyone was working together to oppress people. And so many people really started having this healthy skepticism give way to reflexive suspicion and even paranoia, just on a mass scale. And we saw that. We saw the outcome with a ton of people declining to get vaccinated, not for reasons based in fact, but for just lies like vaccines making you magnetic or vaccines having microchips, as you said, all these things that were just fear-driven nonsense.
There does seem to be a peculiar belief among people who buy into conspiracy theories that uncertainty must be an evasion or a lie in some way. That dealing with a strange virus that we've never seen before, there's something nefarious about that. That somebody up there must know what's going on and must be in charge and be calling the shots, which I think for people who've covered the government find a rather ridiculous idea. But there's some attraction to that.
Conspiracy theories provide really immediate, easy answers for very complicated questions and problems. And I think it's kind of like fear of the dark. People are very afraid of the unknown. They panic. It makes them uncomfortable. And so having these answers that, whether or not they make sense, people latch on to them. And, you know, if you are looking for a missing puzzle piece, you'll eventually find something that fits. Even if the facts aren't there, people just leap to conclusions before waiting for evidence to support it.
Well, Jesselyn Cook, author of The Quiet Damage, QAnon and the Destruction of the American Family, thank you. And stay with us, because in about 10 minutes we'll have our discussion period. Our third and final panelist is David Rand, who's MIT professor of management science and cognitive sciences. In the journal Science, he joined with fellow scholars Gordon Pennicock of Cornell and lead author Tom Costello of American University to publish a very interesting study, a pretty large sample of Americans who believed in fake conspiracy ideas, had interviews with a chatbot about their reasons for believing what they believed in. They told the chatbot why they believed that, and the chatbot responded with information that led some 20% of them to abandon much or possibly all of their conspiratorial belief. Professor Rand, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And in the context of this subject, is the glass 20% full or 80% empty? That is, how good is changing the minds of 20% of people who believe in strange things?
Well, coming into this, the general wisdom in the academic world, and I think in the world more generally, is that facts and sort of evidence-based persuasion would be pretty much totally ineffective for people that believed conspiracy theories, particularly people that were really bought in and truly believed them. And so our expectation going into this is that we would find very little effect. And so I think relative to that, like a 20% reduction in average belief is much bigger than what we expected. And it's much bigger than people have found from other attempts to sort of talk conspiracy theorists out of their beliefs.
And you found that among that 20%, a couple of months later, they hadn't reverted to believing in the ideas that you had disabused them of. They still were, I would say that they still were correct in their view.
That's right. We found that the corrective effect was extremely durable. And so this suggests that it really fundamentally changed the way that they thought about things, rather than just kind of nudging them a little bit or something like that. It really changed things. And if you look through these conversations, you can see why. It's like, rather than just saying, oh, you shouldn't believe this or whatever, it asks, what are the specific evidence that you see to support this conspiracy theory, and just goes through one after the other and sort of knocks down all of these pieces of evidence by providing non-conspiratorial explanations for these things. And so you could imagine that like this could really change your mind. Particularly, it looked like a lot of the people that were believing the conspiracy theories hadn't ever really heard that much of the alternative explanations. Like we have this paradigmatic example where it was a person that was saying they believed the 9/11 attacks were an inside job, and they cited their evidence was they said, I've watched a lot of YouTube videos about
Yes.
that, and I find it very convincing. And they're like, oh, well, Building 7 collapsed, like World Trade Center Building 7 collapsed, even though it wasn't hit by a plane, and jet fuel doesn't burn hot enough to melt steel. And then the AI is like, it's true that Building 7 collapsed, but that's because it was hit by debris from one of the buildings that was hit by a plane. And like, it's true that steel doesn't melt hot enough, sorry, that jet fuel doesn't burn hot enough to melt steel, but actually that's irrelevant because you don't need to melt steel. Jet fuel is hot enough to make it lose more than 50% of its strength, which is enough to make the building collapse. And then you see the person at the end be like, oh, well, okay.
And this was one of, I guess, hundreds of exchanges between people who believed in the conspiracy theory and the chatbot. Yes?
Thousands, actually. So in our paper, we had over 2,000 people total. And then since the paper came out, we put it out in the world. You can go to www.debunkbot.com, and it's there, and you can talk to it about whatever you want. And we've had over 80,000 people go to DebunkBot since we released it, and we've seen thousands and thousands of people change their minds over the course of these conversations.
And these were limited conversations, just a few questions.
Yeah, it's like 3 rounds of back and forth. I think on average they lasted like 8 minutes.
Yeah. I don't know which I was more impressed by, the chatbot's instant access to the explanation of why a steel girder need not be at 1,500 degrees centigrade for a plane to crash into it and cause it to buckle and collapse, or the chatbot's complete lack of any judgmental approach to what the person believed. It seemed to be the chatbot seemed to be I don't know whether it's the perfect therapist or what, but it was someone who just in no way looked down on the person who was putting these ideas to it.
Right, and had infinite patience.
Yes, infinite,
Yeah.
superhuman patience. Yes.
Yeah. And we've done a follow-up experiment where we tell it not to, we say your job is to talk the person out of believing the experiment, but you're not allowed to use facts and evidence and alternative, reasons and stuff like that. And if you do that, it totally breaks it and it doesn't work at all. It's sort of just trying to do the nice, like.
You mean if the argument is ad hominem, you've fallen into the trap of crazy people who believe this sort of thing? Say something.
Yeah, exactly. And it'd be like, yes, it talks about like psychological reasons that, people believe conspiracy theories and makes people try to feel safe, whatever. Like that doesn't work. But we haven't yet tried telling it to be nasty, that is to give the facts without being sympathetic. And so we'll see, how much that's required.
Of course, one of the troubling questions raised by your work is, can the same chatbot that could convince 20% of a sample that some crazy ideas that they've been very strongly attached to for a while really don't hold water, could it just as equally persuade 20% of a large sample to believe some crackpot theory?
Right. So I think on the one hand, our work clearly shows the potential persuasive power of these AI chatbots. We haven't looked yet at what happens if it tries to talk people into believing things that are false. We are about to start a project on that. But I'm sort of cautiously optimistic that I'm sure it will be able to be somewhat persuasive, but I am cautiously optimistic that it will be substantially better at convincing people of the truth than convincing people of falsehoods, because in general, the truth just makes more sense. Like in general, the non-conspiratorial explanation is much simpler than the conspiratorial explanation. And not always. You can come up with some, edge cases where that isn't the case, but I think in general that's the case. And so hopefully that means that the true answers will sort of be more compelling and stick more than the false ones.
I think I may have mentioned to Nancy Blumenthal recently, reading about the Nazis who opposed nuclear physics, atomic physics, because they saw it as Jew physics. But one of the complaints against atomic physics, nuclear physics, was that it defied common sense, that it was not, it was out of tune with nature, and defied common sense. So that argument was deployed on the other side. What's your takeaway here in terms of, let's say, if we've one of these families that that Jesselyn has written about. At various times, people try talking their mother, daughter, father, whoever it might be, out of their deepening involvement in these ideas, conspiratorial ideas. What's the takeaway from your work? What advice would you give, or is it too soon to say?
The implication of our work is that if you have access to a huge amount of information and can deploy exactly the right information, it doesn't work for everyone, but it may be more effective than you might imagine. The problem is, as a human, it's extremely hard to do that. Like a classic thing that happens when someone tries to talk a conspiracy theorist out of believing their conspiracy is they just bring up all different kinds of sort of randomish evidence that's not real, and the non-conspiracist doesn't really know what to say because they're saying all these things that you've never heard of before because they're not real. And then the conspiracy theorist will push on the things they say. Well, see, you don't know about this, and then the person, the debunker, is on the defensive, and it doesn't really work out very well most of the time. But you can't really do that with GPT because it's heard of all the things. And so whatever the conspiracist comes up with, GPT has a response to it. And so I think that is like an important part of what makes it effective, along with, as you were saying, its infinite patience. It doesn't start calling the person an idiot and getting obviously frustrated with them and so on.
Yeah, I was very impressed with the patience of the chatbot. I have to say.
Yeah, and so I think the idea is that if you have a conspiratorial friend or family member or things like that, you can potentially use the DebunkBot tool to help you in those conversations. Like either you can just direct them and say, hey, go talk to the AI about it, or you can have it yourself. And when they say things, you can just type it in and see how it responds. And then it will come up with the information that can help you in your efforts.
I just, before we bring all the panelists together, I want to go back to just one other thing that you've done, another study that you've done, in which you found that people who believe in conspiracies, unusual conspiracies, tend to, or they may be only 12% of a sample that you studied, but that 12% tended to believe that a majority of the entire sample agreed with them.
Right. Conspiracy theorists, we found dramatically overestimated how much other people also believed in the conspiracy theory. And I think part of this is we found that a strong predictor of belief in conspiracies was overconfidence. And sort of overconfidence in one's own, abilities to understand things. But I think another big part of it is that conspiracy theorists, I think, fairly rarely get corrective, pushback. And that, like, when you're at a party or you're at Thanksgiving and your family member starts talking about a conspiracy theory, there are some people that are willing to get into it with them and be like, oh, no debate about it. But almost everyone doesn't like conflict and will just say, okay, Bob, and change the subject.
Yeah.
And so that means the people that if they say a conspiracy theory, they don't hear anyone disagree with them, particularly if they're a little bit overconfident. It's easy to conclude from that, well, probably the other people also believed it.
David Rand of MIT, thank you so much for talking about the study. Stay with us. I'd like to bring back Nancy Rosenblum and also Jesselyn Cook, and starting with Professor Rosenblum. I'm curious whether you have reactions to what you've heard from your fellow panelists that you'd like to add.
Of course, I have. These are fascinating studies that are going on. So let me start or get with David because he was the latest. I guess I'm wondering how you think the fact that they're talking to this artificial intelligence matters, besides that it's patient and so on and so forth. Does it have authority for people? I mean, is it think that something is coming that's persuasive from this chatbot because they've been taught that these artificial intelligence is superior?
Yeah, so we looked at, to get some insight into that, we looked at how the effect of the conversation varied based on how much the people trusted AI.
Right.
And we found that, as you might expect, people that trust AI more show a bigger reduction in belief, that the conversation is more effective for people that trust AI more. But even for people that totally don't trust AI, we still found a significant treatment effect. So I think even people who see it as totally not coming from a position of authority, still to some extent have trouble arguing with the logic of the information that it produces. And kind of more generally, we have this other paper on fact checking by humans. Like a lot of what social media companies do now is they'll put a warning label on something and say, fact checkers say this is false. And there was concern that that might backfire among people that don't trust fact checkers because it's like, oh, it's a badge of honor or whatever. But we had a whole bunch of different studies with more than 10,000 Americans, and we meta-analyzed the whole thing. And we very clearly see that warning labels do work even for people that don't trust fact checkers. They work a little bit less well, but you still get reductions in belief. And so I think it's people like in the abstract are like, oh, I don't trust this. But then when they see the actual piece of information, they're like, well, okay, maybe that actually makes some sense here.
Nancy, was there something you wanted to ask Jesselyn Cook?
I'll let somebody else go now, and let me look at my notes.
Okay, you look at your notes. Jesselyn, I mean, what do you make of what you've heard from your fellow panelists?
I'm also so interested in this study you did, David, and I love stories about AI for good because I think there's so much panic about AI right now, and especially with these big problems that feel like they're just growing. It's so incredible to see an intervention like this with lasting impact. And I actually asked a couple of the subjects of my book what they thought about your tool because two of the ones who have come out of QAnon, and their thoughts were quite interesting. They get similar to what Nancy was just saying. They felt that AI was different from the kind of elite sources of information that they were resistant to initially. Like they felt the media and the government and really any authoritative source of information could not be trusted just by virtue of them being elites. And so the AI they looked at as being neutral. And so they thought maybe that was part of what made it so effective. And I wonder, it's quite similar to Nancy's question, but I wonder if that kind of factored into your thinking.
Yeah, so I think that makes sense that there's some element of that going on. In a follow-up study, we tried to get at that in a certain sense by telling people in the beginning, instead of saying you're going to talk to an AI and it's impartial and whatever, we told them you're going to talk to an AI. The AI is going to try to talk you out of the conspiracy theory, so that they know going in that the AI like has an agenda in some sense. Or another version, we said the task is you're supposed to have a debate with the AI and you're supposed to talk it into believing the conspiracy theory and it's going to try to talk you out of it. And we found that in both of those conditions, it worked just as well as it did in the condition where we told them it was objective. So at least knowing that it has an agenda in that sense wasn't enough to undercut it. But follow-ups that we're going to do are things like telling them that it was trained on liberal or conservative sources. So it's like a Democrat bot or a Republican bot and see how much that affects it. We're doing an adversarial collaboration actually with some political psychologists where they think that's going to make a really big difference and we think it's not going to make that much difference. So we'll see how it shakes out.
Now, from what I saw, you didn't just ask people after their encounter with the chatbot, do you no longer believe that? But you asked them to grade by what percent, how strong was their belief in it? Having I believe it's a woman who believed about the story about the truther view of 9/11. She was 100% confident that this was an inside job before her encounter, and then she was 40%. Does that mean we grade her? She's under 50%. She therefore yes or no. It comes out as a no, and are there lots of people who retain bits of conspiratorial thinking even as they give up on some of it?
Totally. I mean, and to be clear, it's not like we started with 2,000 people that very strongly believed the conspiracy, and at the end we had 2,000 people that had totally disavowed it. Right? This is more about like undermining the belief, causing people to have some more doubts about it, some more questions about it, and sort of like stably reducing that certainty. And so the two different kind of numbers that we talk about in the paper, on the one hand, we say the average belief on this sort of 0 to 100 scale was reduced by 20%. And then if you draw a line at 50 and you say people below 50 don't believe it and people above 50 do believe it, then we converted 25% of people from being above 50 to below 50. So you could say 25% of people we talked out of it in some sense. Okay. But yeah, and so not to oversell it, it's not like it cures all
Not,
conspiracy belief. But the
not a
point,
silver bullet here.
yeah, it's not. There's no silver bullet. It's not a
Yes.
silver bullet. But I think it produced more of a change than we and others expected, and that sort of says something about the psychology of conspiracy beliefs, where it's not that you are just totally blinded. Everyone that believes in a conspiracy is totally blinded to reason and evidence by their, identity commitments and motivations and stuff like that. There's like a good chunk of people who will be like, oh, basically, I never actually heard that argument before. Like, okay.
Yeah.
And we've been doing follow-up work on other contexts where we find similar things, like explaining to people the structural roots of racial disparities in income, which is something there's a ton of discussion about, but we find similar size effects on like people that initially are like, no, there's no sort of like structural contributors to that. The AI explains it to them, and then you get, a similar size increase in belief, even to this thing that's like very identity sort of culture war salient. I think there's a good chunk of people that just never heard the actual explanation.
Here's a question from an attendee who prefers to remain anonymous. This person writes, it sounds like believers in conspiracy theories are very similar to religious believers, a need of belief. How can you ever peel away the human need for answers without succumbing to conspiracy theories? Are conspiracy theories now a given in civilization? Nancy Rosenblum, I'll give that to you to answer.
Well, I certainly think that your questioner is onto something when he or she says that to the extent that a conspiracy claim, and I reject this notion that there are theories, to the
Right.
extent that people are attached and long-term attached and powerfully attached, many of these conspiracy accounts really do have occult-like qualities or and apocalyptic qualities that echo religion. And so that QAnon is a very good example of that. I mean, part of the attraction of QAnon is that it has an invisible but true enormous leader, right? We don't know who it is, but he knows everything and can lead us. It has an apocalyptic claim. It says that after the end, there will be the phoenix will rise and civilization will be reproduced. So it has many of the characteristics of a religion. So I think your questioner is right, and that was one thing I wanted to pose to Jesselyn. I looked back at my notes about her wonderful talk, and that is the difference between that sort of conspiracy argument, the apocalyptic one, and something like Pizzagate, which says that Hillary Clinton is running trafficking out of the basement of a pizza parlor, which is political enemy, right?
Yes, yeah.
Is there
Which led an unfortunate fellow to actually
shoot up the pizza
come to
parlor?
Washington and shoot up the pizza parlor,
Right.
not very
Right.
far from NPR headquarters. Yes.
They seem to me to be very different, and I wonder whether the reactions of people. Do you know is there any difference in the reactions of people to these different kinds of conspiracies?
Yeah, that's been really interesting because for lots of the people I talked to, it felt like conspiracy theories just gave them a way to satisfy their grievances. There's some interesting brain science that shows that feeling aggrieved actually kind of triggers dopamine in the same way that a behavioral addiction might. It does actually make us feel good to feel aggrieved, which is odd. But for a lot of people, I think kind of going from even the like hyper partisan media toward conspiracy theory territory, we like to feel like we've been wronged in some way. We like to feel like a victim, and we like to feel like there's something we're fighting for. And so conspiracy theories like Pizzagate can definitely satisfy that desire. Whereas the kind of the QAnon type thing, which gives us this promise that a better world is coming, this beautiful future, the Great Awakening is coming. For some conspiracy theorists, the way I talked to them about it, they said it gave them hope. They just really had hope for the future, and it gave them something to hold on to in a very uncertain, scary world. And especially in COVID, a lot of people really wanted to believe in these QAnon type theories because they told them it was all going to be okay, and they just had to keep believing. And eventually the bad guys would fall and good would prevail for all. So it's two very different kind of appeals there, but it's quite powerful.
And David, you have thoughts on religion and
Yeah, I mean, I think that to the question of if people are always going to look for answers and explanations for things, that I think makes a lot of sense. And I think part of what effective debunking of conspiracies involves is providing non-conspiratorial explanations. So you're not saying you don't need an answer for that, but you're sort of displacing the conspiratorial answer with like an actual like factual answer. And I think that to the extent that our like debunk bot was effective, I think that's a lot of what it was doing. And so people at the end still have an explanation. They just have an explanation that makes more sense. And again, I don't think that that is satisfying for everyone. I think that there are, a lot of people that are sort of looking to get psychological needs out of it, and therefore are not moved by it. But there's a good chunk of people who were, I think sort of took the information at face value, the conspiracy information, and said, yeah, okay, this makes sense. But then when they get something that makes more sense, they're like, oh, well, actually, this other thing makes more sense. So fine.
But I'm very glad that the listener or attendee raised religion because I intended to, and I just wonder. I think that Nancy writes something to this effect at one point that perhaps the kind of truth that we're looking for in different circumstances is not the same. That is, there might be people who honor certain truths in their religious lives that might not be the same way in which they would look at whether the economy grew or didn't grow last year or over the past years. There's a different kind of a relationship to fact, and the truth, the religious truth, involves belonging, and it may be less important to be shown that something is true or false than to be shown that that belief connects you to, becomes one of the cognoscenti that Nancy, that you mentioned. Are there different degrees of truth which people commute to and from?
There are different kinds of truth.
Mm-hmm.
That religion and reality, right, are people believe to be true, and maybe elements are, but that's not what's mainly going on. I think
Mm-hmm.
conspiracism out there today. It's more of what David was talking about, which is factual truth.
Mm-hmm.
And he said something I thought very important, which is sort of almost as an aside, that factual truth is attractive.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons that's true for people is that conspiracism, right, and falsity of all kinds, you have to keep escalating it, has to keep changing it. You can't say it just once and it's over, which is obviously true of QAnon, and it's true of Trump's lies and conspiracy claims as well. And the fact that the simplicity of factual truth or the consistency of factual truth, I think, is psychologically very important to people. And that may be one of the reasons why your experiment works, because you're making simple claims against the escalation, the constantly having to keep up with the claims of one of these bizarre political conspiracies, which are effective and have a political purpose.
And I think that to add to that, in other studies that we've done, we find that like in general, like most people say they want to have accurate beliefs. Like I don't think most people are like, yeah, whatever, I don't care whether the things that I believe are true or false or not. Like, but I think that also when you talk about religion, a core part of faith is that you're not supposed to be looking for evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Faith is something you're supposed to hold even in the face of countervailing evidence.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like it's fundamentally different. And so I think I'm actually curious what Jesselyn thinks about this, but in terms of the sort of variation across conspiracy believers, I wonder if there are some for whom it is faith, like a faith kind of thing, in which case they are going to be resistant to evidence. And there are other people that are doing their best to understand the world and just have been given these or have come across these conspiratorial explanations and adopted them, but are then willing and sort of happy maybe even to get non-conspiratorial explanations to, displacing the originals.
Jesselyn, what do you say?
Yeah, the several of the people I talked to were very religious before they got into conspiracy theories, and I think that in a way kind of primed them, this kind of conviction in the unseen. They didn't need evidence, they didn't need facts, they just wanted to believe. And I think with conspiracy theories, as is the case with some aspects of religion, true versus false is not as important as good versus evil. It's very Manichaean, and you get to be on the side of good. If you are part of the QAnon movement, you believe you're a digital soldier and you're fighting for what is right. You're standing up for your fellow patriots. And that is so important. So even if all the facts don't quite add up, you still believe that you're contributing to this greater cause. And that's really compelling. And I think it's not just what makes it easy for people to get into these rabbit holes, but also it makes it really hard to get out because it's giving them a reason to get out of bed. And they do feel like they're really on the good guy's side.
You know, one of the characters you write about, one of the people who became involved with QAnon, was a woman who was very upset about injustice in American life and corporate profiteering. And in the phrase that occurred to me was she bet her psyche virtually on Bernie Sanders. I mean, she was all in a way that few people are all in politically. And when he lost, and then also when the famous tape transcripts were released, which showed that the Democratic National Committee had tilted against Bernie Sanders, the powers that be were evil from that point. From that point on, she was reacting. I mean, one of the things she was reacting to was, in fact, a a political development that was reported by legitimate news organizations, not by crazies on the web. And she was reacting to reality at that point, that the party did not want Bernie Sanders to get nominated.
And in some sense, that was definitionally a conspiracy. You know,
Yeah, you could say
private
that. Yes.
actors acting in secret to affect outcomes.
Yeah. So that was the one moment where I felt, oh, I, she certainly took it to extremes, but that broke her. Most of the people you write about, Jesselyn, seem to something happens in which there's some need for refuge from reality. And it struck me. I don't know if I'm reading too much into that or not.
Absolutely right. Yeah, for her, I mean, Bernie is an anti-establishment politician, and it seems maybe kind of wild for someone to go from Bernie on the left all the way to QAnon on the far right. But there is this common theme that the people in the highest positions of power don't have everyday folks' interests at heart. They are like driving for profit and just bettering their own interests. And so QAnon, of course, takes that to a great extreme. But what this subject in the book, Alice, found in Bernie was a lot of truth, a lot of real conspiracy he did speak about. And there are so many reasons for Americans to not trust the government. I mean, we've been mass surveilled, we've been lied to about weapons of mass destruction, the list kind of goes on. And Bernie kind of laid that foundation for her by drawing her attention to these very real injustices. And then QAnon warped that into something much more out there and wild and extreme. But it really was a more natural path than you might have expected for her. And what really made the difference for her to get out of that frame of thought was, in addition to meeting these underlying psychological needs she had, her family allowed her to keep her dignity, which I think is quite difficult for people trying to support their loved ones who've gone deep into conspiracy theories, because we're so quick to judge and we're so quick to get frustrated. And this is, I'm sure, also why DebunkBot is really effective, is because for this woman, Alice, even if she had come to realize that all of these conspiracy theories were false, if her family had told her, you're an idiot, you're stupid, this is crazy, even if she had come to realize they're false, she would not have come out, because she would have no one there waiting for her. She would feel like a bad person. And so you kind of have to leave that door open and give people a chance to emerge and challenge the ideas, not challenge them, which again, I think is perhaps why DebunkBot really speaks to people, because it's not a personal attack. It's really challenging the theories themselves.
Nancy, where does all of this leave us politically right now, where we have Donald Trump reelected to the presidency, his campaign having, they, for example, went heavy on the peculiar stories about Haitians in Ohio, and Vice President-elect Vance even went so far as to say that the truth of this really doesn't matter so much if the story I tell brings attention to the larger problem, meaning there are immigrants in the United States, in this case legal immigrants. Where are we politically? What are the challenges we face right now?
Well, I think you're asking a question that's important for sort of redirecting our emphasis here, which is we've talked an awful lot about the conspiracy believers and why they do, and not as much about the conspiracy makers and what their purposes are. And we have in our government today and coming into power, people who have made careers based on selling conspiracy claims. And I think we're going to see it in spades, and we're going to see one of the things that it will come out of it, and we know this, watching what's going on with Trump in 2025, is retribution against their supposedly deep state enemies. So we're going to see an awful lot of retribution in various ways. This is going to be acted out in public political institutional life. It's worrisome.
Jesselyn, do you share Nancy's pretty bleak view of what's in store?
I mean, we can take Donald Trump at his word. He said he's going to do these things. It is very alarming. And in terms of just looking forward, I think a lot of what we considered wild conspiracy theories have actually blended in. They're not going anywhere. They're starting to feel normalized. And that's what's really scary. The Overton window is shifting. And even if we look back to 2016 to now, there's been so much that we would not have accepted back then that now is just kind of how things go in our political system. And so it does worry me to look forward 4 years and imagine what will kind of be just absorbed into our politics by then. So I think we're in for a lot more of this, and the conversations are just going to get more and more challenging as this becomes so politicized.
And David, you're the one who's doing work in how people might be separated from their bizarre beliefs. Are you at all optimistic about what's in store for us?
Well, I guess one thing that I am, personally worried about is that one of the groups that Trump has been promising to take to show retribution against is researchers working on misinformation. And there already has been like big attacks by Republicans on some prominent people that were doing a lot of sort of tracking of online misinformation, people at University of Washington and at Stanford, they sort of had successfully changed the narrative around social media to be, in 2016, it was pressure for them to reduce the spread of inaccurate information. And now the primary PR pressure they feel is pressure to avoid looking biased against conservatives. And so I'm quite nervous about what the implications of that are going to be once Trump is back in the White House.
Is your field heavily dependent on federal grants?
Yeah, so there's the federal grants, and then he's also been threatening to take away tax exempt status of institutions of higher education, and there's many things beyond denying federal grants that one has to be worried about.
Well, David Brand, Jesselyn Cook, and Nancy Blumenthal, thank you. Yes, Nancy Rosenblum. I'm sorry. Thank you all very much for an interesting, if not always terribly encouraging, hour discussion of conspiracies and conspiracism. Thanks to all three of you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. It was great.
Also, many thanks to Joshua Plout and Roni Giuliano of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, which produces Global Connections, and also our technical director, Bobby Grandone. Our program sponsor is the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization which represents, in the U.S., Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. The group's website is www.afrmc.org. I'm Robert Siegel, and this has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.